Hey everyone, Jason here from Off the Beaten Path and welcome to another video. This particular trip, I've got Bruce with me in his 200, Mark with his Colorado, and the still you just saw there was us stopping at Port Punker on the way to Beverages, which is just down the end of the Buckland Valley where we aired down before continuing on along Selwyn Road, which is where we're driving now in the footage that you're looking at. It was a short drive down Selwyn Road. Now our plan here was for a fairly long trip. We're going to go up over Mount Selwyn, along to Mount Sarah, then over via Basalt Knob to Blue Rag, and then out. But the trip did not go according to plan, as you might have guessed from the title. So we just turned off there, off the Mount Selwyn Road onto the Dingo Creek track, which is probably one of, if not the most direct route to actually get to the summit of Mount Selwyn. So it starts off fairly flat, but then as soon as you cross that little river crossing there, it's a pretty steep run up to the summit. This first section here is, as I always say, much steeper than it looks on camera, and is prone to being sort of a bit slippery and clay at the time. At the time we were driving it, it was fine though. Traction was really good. There really wasn't anything to be concerned about. Hadn't been any recent rain or anything, but look, even in that shot you can probably tell just how steep that section is. Overall the track is quite steep. It's only about 3 kilometres long, and over that distance it rises around 600 metres. So as you can gather from those numbers, it is pretty steep. There are some sections in the middle that are less steep, but yeah, the very bottom section here is one of the steeper parts of the track. You do get some really nice views. Condition on this track, as I keep saying on all the tracks, does vary markedly. I've driven this before when it's been had a lot more loose gravel and rock on it, and traction's been a lot less sure. The last time before this video that we drove it, we were actually coming down it, and it was a bit loose and slippery coming down. None of that today. Very stable. Just, as long as you're sensible with your throttle control, you're running your tyres at sensible pressures. For me on these sort of tracks these days, I pretty much always run about 20 psi in the front and about 22 to 23 in the back. Just because of the weight that I have on the back of my vehicle, I don't tend to run the rear tyre pressures any lower than that, particularly when I know I'm driving steep stuff and a lot of the weight's going to transfer onto the back anyway. And this is, as you can see, on that northern side of Selwyn, was bushfire affected. Still, over 2 years now later, still a lot of recovery to happen. Sections like the one we're driving just there can be a little bit lumpy, but as I say, if you keep your throttle control sensible, it's not too much to worry about. Now let me apologise too for the length of this video. I hope you guys don't mind such a long video. This was a huge day. We left Albury at like 7 in the morning, and after everything that happens on this trip, it was like midnight when we got home. So we kind of condensed like 13 hours into 40 minutes. There are some great views from sections of the Dingo Creek track here, so which is why I've included a little bit of it, and it's not a track that I've had on video before, so it was something that I was keen to show a little bit more of. Now it's worth noting that this track is a seasonally closed track, so this was recorded just after the seasonally closed tracks had reopened. You can see that sign there on the left is actually, I don't know why it's there because the gate's up here. So this was our first little challenge of the day. The track's definitely open. You saw the gate down below was open. So we're not doing anything wrong, but somehow somebody's come through. I don't know whether it's before or after the rangers unlocked the gate here. The gate is unlocked, as you'll see, but somebody's cut the end off a tree on the side of the track there to go around the gate, and the tree stump is actually uphill of the gate. So you can see there as I push on the gate, like it's definitely unlocked and open. It's meant to be open, but they've cut the end off that tree stump and it's actually resting against the gate and stopping you from opening it. I did have a good look at that. There was no way of moving that from this side easily. It was pretty heavy, so we were left with not too many options but to actually just follow that side track that's been pushed in there around the gate. I have, since this was filmed, I have been back down Dingo Creek track. The rangers have been back and fixed this up. That stump's out of the way. The gate's properly open now, so, and they've blocked this little side track off as they should, so that people are driving on the marked tracks. So, but really at this point we would have either had to try and turn around and drive all the way down, or we actually had to follow this side track that had been cut in. It was a bit lumpy and off camber because obviously it's not part of the main track. I was actually worried about tipping and hitting that steel post there as we came around, and there wasn't actually a lot of room. But managed to get past without too much difficulty. Just a really good example there of why, stay on the marked tracks, follow the rules. If a track's seasonally closed, it's seasonally closed. Come back and drive it when it's properly open, and don't do stuff like that that's going to block the gate for other people. So here we're just heading on what is the dividing range track. So this wasn't actually on our way, but we were so close to the Mount Selwyn summit, we decided to shoot up there. It's only about 2 or 3 k's, so there you can see the start of the Selwyn summit track. You'll have seen me drive that before. Every time I'm in the area, I pretty much head up there just because it's one of my favourite spots. So I don't need to show you that whole track again. There's the start. Here's the end up to the little summit there at Selwyn. Such a cracking spot to visit. It was worth the 2k side track. It was such a nice day. Blue skies, super clear. And here's me making the top section look a lot harder than it needs to. So it's interesting. The Pajero is obviously IFS front and rear, so doesn't have the flex of the vehicles that have solid axles in the rear. I'm going to say that's a factor because it always seems to be. And because you saw me there with a little bit of a wheel lift coming up there. You'll see Bruce and Mark come up next. So here's Bruce and his 200, which is obviously IFS front, solid axle in the rear. That thing also has a button for just about every situation, so it tends to make everything look pretty easy. And he's just driving straight up there, nice and easy. And here comes Mark in his Colorado, which is also IFS in the front and solid axle in the rear. And he's just crawling up there nicely at a nice steady pace, choosing a good line, probably a better line than I chose, to be honest. And there he is. So no wheel lifts from either of those guys. I should have got some footage while we're up on Selwyn, but by all means check out my other videos to see that. It's not a big area up there, a lot of fun, and yeah, we're so close it was worth checking out. So here we're back on that Great Dividing Range track and we're heading east towards Mount Sarah. Now, I don't know if you were just hearing that on the video. It'll depend how I get the audio settings right. There's a little bit of a noise coming through there, and it's not shown on the video because I don't think I was recording at the time. I actually pulled up and checked. I thought there was a stick dragging. I thought there was something going on with the car. So I stopped, had a good look underneath the car, crawled all around it, couldn't see anything obvious. I thought it might have been, maybe in the end, I decided it was a crook wheel bearing, which, as you'll see later in this video, was not correct. Now, when you're driving through to Mount Sarah, there's a heap of tracks in this part of Mount Selwyn, between Selwyn and Sarah. They all kind of generally end up in approximately the same place, but it really does pay to have the topo maps to be able to double check your navigation, because yeah, it would be easy to get off track here, that's for sure, because yeah, there's just a heap of different tracks all through here. So yeah, I was saying about that noise, right? So in the end, I decided that it was probably a wheel bearing. I've already had 2 wheel bearings in this car replaced, and I thought, you know what, that's probably all it is. I'll get the mechanic to look at it next service. But I was wrong. So wrong. So yeah, this video really is all about listen to the noises in your car. If they're not right, go home. So here we're working our way still across to Mount Sarah. That's the water spur track there on the right hand side. So that kind of heads southwest down to the Humphrey River track, which we've just driven recently, and you'll see in an upcoming video, which is a great access point down into Wanangata. But that's not today's video. So today we've kept going there towards Mount Sarah. And I think at this point this is actually still called the Selwyn Road, or the Mount Selwyn Road. Now, there used to be a hut called the Guy's Mount Sarah Hut. That's no longer here. And just before you get to the helipad area and the summit, the track splits. If you go straight ahead, that takes you up to the helipad or summit area. If you go left, that takes you onto the Sarah Spur track. All of these tracks through here are quite drivable, and there's nothing sort of super challenging about any of them. Quite a nice drive. You're up pretty high all the way through here, sort of around 1450 to 1500 metres. And yeah, just working our way along. It's about 2 k's from the water spur track up to Mount Sarah. So just coming up here to that fork in the track. So yeah, the left track is where we ultimately want to go. That takes you on the left there, that takes you down to the Sarah Spur track, which will take us through to the Wanangata River and other parts of the high country. But first off, we're actually heading up here to the summit area, which includes an emergency sort of helipad. There's not a lot of views from the top of Mount Sarah here. It is pretty treed in, but there is quite a nice open area for the helipad. I have seen people use it as a camping area as well. It's not actually designed to be a camping area. And there is not so much a trip point, but there is a survey marker just over the back side here. I didn't actually get that on camera, but it's not too hard to find. There's a couple of pegs either side of it to sort of identify it. So after that, here we are heading down the Sarah Spur track. This is quite a long run. It's generally downhill the whole way. The first section is about 4 kilometres, and then there's a 16 kilometre section down to the Wanangata track, which from there, the rest of the Sarah Spur track then rises up to the Brewery Creek Road. There are a few softer sections on this track, particularly in this first section. The odd little bog hole like this section here. Most of them have bypass tracks, but you know, we were there, so we drove through it. There's a few little side tracks like you saw there on the left. And this area coming up, it's every time of year it's wet. I don't know if there's a spring here or something, or what the go is, but it's always wet and a little bit muddy through here. every time I've sort of come through this track, it's been in similar condition, and that's whether or not there's been recent rain. So this particular day there hadn't been any recent rain, so we were kind of surprised with how much water was sitting around. And then there's this long muddy section that we just came across. Now, I had driven this before and it was muddy, but it wasn't this muddy. It's probably just a function of traffic. So here we go. Again, there's a bypass track on the right, but when you got friends there to pull you out, why not just stay on the track and drive the mud? It wasn't actually that deep, and it had a good firm base. A little bit of a deep hole just there on the right, but all good. Just for fun, you get to see that again. So this that was on GoPro. Obviously, this is on the Sony camcorder. Probably gives you a bit better view of the action. Yes, this video was filmed before I fitted the side steps, so that tells you how far behind I am in my video editing, because the side step video has been up for a little while by now. So next up was Bruce in his 200 series. He was only too happy to test that out. And as you can see, as expected, no difficulty at all. For the 200, getting this stuff up on the clearance. He's just got a standard 2-inch aftermarket lift. Pretty sure it's the ARB old man ear kit that he's got in there. And he's running Maxxis mud terrain tyres, for those that are interested. Testing. Now Mark in his Colorado doesn't actually have a lift kit still, and he doesn't have a snorkel, which comes in important later on. He wasn't going to drive the mud, he drove the bypass track, and he actually wanted to try and stay out of the ruts. But as you can see, I'm just pointing out to him there on the left, our left when you're viewing this, but his right as he's driving the track, there's actually a rock there. So he really had no choice but to put the tyres in the ruts and drive it, because he just passed the rock right there. You can see he's got his tyres on and trying to jump back up out of those ruts, but he didn't need to. He was able to drive that quite comfortably. So from there, we're back on the main Spur track. Climbing. So yeah, as I was saying, that one section, that is pretty much the only muddy, boggy section that we saw for the entire trip, and it's always that section of the Spur track. If you've got the HEMA maps, you'll see the Spur from Mount Sarah down to the Wangangara River. Hey, check out that view. Had to drop this little bit of footage in. That's just amazing, isn't it? Looking straight across the high country there to the southeast. But yeah, if you've got the HEMA map and you look at the Spur track between Mount Sarah and the Wangangara River, you'll see the top section where Mackenzie's track kind of joins in with it. By the way, that Mackenzie's track seems to be non-existent. You'll see the black D there for difficult. That's pretty much where the boggy section is, and then after that it's marked medium. So you can see here there's quite a ridge to the Spur track. You're literally following the ridge line of the spur of the mountain range all the way down. It's quite a nice drive, great views. Not a particularly difficult track. Does get kind of steep in sections. As you can see here, we've just changed over to the next section a little bit further along. Try, obviously to keep this video to a reasonable length. I haven't put everything in there. It'll be 12 hours long, but more than 12 hours long. but try to show you the different types of terrain that you will see if you want to get out there and check these tracks out for yourself, which I definitely recommend that you do. As always, there's plenty of sections where there's been fallen trees, and everybody that clears these seems to clear them, you know, just enough so that you can just barely get past. Times like that, I'm glad I'm driving a Pajero and not the 200 that's a little bit wider. But he always seems to get through without too much in the way of difficulty at all. Now you can see as we're coming down this part of the Sarah Spur track, getting a little bit closer to the valley bottom, you can see the other side of the Sarah Spur track there rising. That's that yellow line on the ridge line sort of straight ahead. So after you cross the Wangangara River, the rest of the Sarah Spur track climbs up on the other side. It's a little bit like Billy Goat's Bluff, not nearly as steep, but a little bit like it in that you've got to climb up to a helipad and then the track changes direction and then you climb some more. So just working our way down here, there's a few switchbacks. As you get closer down to the river, you might be able to see the river just down there to the right, or you might be able to see the track close to the river there where the crossing is. As you can see on these lower sections, there's not really much in the way of room for overtaking or passing. Just first gear, low range, slow and steady. Goes just on the radio then. Now this might be the last of the switchbacks or turns before getting it, yep, and there's the crossing. So you kind of arrive at this river crossing almost before you know you're getting there. There's not really a very big area this side of the river, that's for sure. Once you cross over, within a sort of about 200 metres, there's actually a bit of a campsite area, which is where we stopped for lunch, which is another story. But yeah, for now, just went down there. It's a good place to stop, wait for the rest of the convoy to catch up, and try and let the brakes cool down a little bit before heading into the water. You see, my brakes are still reasonably warm, bit of steam coming off from there, and that was probably sat there for a good 5 minutes, just waiting for everybody else to catch up before heading across. And as you can see, the crossings there weren't particularly deep. There hadn't been much in the way of rain recently at all. Bruce followed me across in his 200. Likewise, his brakes were reasonably warm. To be expected when you've got a track that's almost 20 kilometres of downhill terrain. Mark came across this, just shot with the Sony camera out the window of Mark's Colorado. His brakes were really hot, really hot. A bit of camera movement there, and it's pretty hard to fully appreciate, but yeah, they were really hot. So just up here on the right was where we stopped for lunch. We pulled up, stopped for about an hour, cooked up some lunch. It's quite a good spot there. Our timing was really good. There was a bunch of guys just leaving when we got there, and you can see some motorcyclists come down the Sarah Spur. They arrived sort of just as we were packing up for lunch, so that worked well as well. So far, so good. Everything had gone according to plan. The plan from here was to head up the rest of the Sarah Spur track to the Brewery Creek Road, then follow that north to Basalt Knob, up onto Blue Rag, and then we're going to have to go out by the Dinner Plain track, because at this particular time, even though it was after the seasonal closures, the Dargo High Plains Road wasn't open this year because they're doing roadworks on it. Now remember the noise I said I heard earlier? It's about to become extremely relevant. So the car's been going fine, apart from that noise I heard up on Selwyn that I kind of thought that's weird. I wonder what that is. It was a little bit metallic. There'd been no issues. And where we are here is about as far from nowhere as you can get. And, you know, the car hasn't been working overly hard. It hasn't been any crazy tracks. Just driving up here over the washout humps. And there it is. It's driving along, middle of nowhere, and it just grinds to a halt. No drive going forward. Initially, I was able to get a little bit of roll out of it. I put it back in drive, tried to drive forward, just shudder and vibration as you saw there on the camera, and then ultimately it stopped rolling. So I couldn't drive forward. I couldn't roll the car. We're literally on the side of the east side of the Spur track, middle of the track, middle of nowhere. It was not looking good. So yeah, turned the car off and getting out, trying to figure out what's going on. I was pretty sure it was something major and mechanical. And in the end, I decided that it was something to do with the driveline, most probably the transfer case. And look, I'm far from a mechanic, but that's just what made sense to me with the way it was binding up and not allowing anything to move. And later on, that proved to be correct. So to give you an idea, there's a HEMA map with a flag dropped right where we were. And there's an aerial from Google Earth. So literally the middle of nowhere, a long way from Dargo, a long way, which is the nearest town, a long way from anywhere. Decided to hook Bruce's 200 up to the back with a winch and try and skull drag the car off. And that was either going to get it out of the way, or I thought it might break the driveline a little more and allow me to drive it. That was a real long shot. But at the very least, we needed to get it off the track, out of people's way, if we're going to have to leave it there for a later recovery. So at this point, Bruce is just dragging me backwards, and the tyres are not turning, it's just sliding. And he's had to reset a couple of times to get a sort of a different angle on the pull to try and pull me off. And we got very little footage of this because we were just trying to figure out what the hell we were going to do. And what you saw just there was Bruce actually, the final bit of the winching. Jared, who was along with us on this trip, took that footage, I think, and it actually broke the transfer case well and truly, and I was able to drive. And while I could drive, I was out of there like a rocket. I drove straight up to the heli point, which is where the camera started again, so I didn't need to turn the GoPro back on. I could only drive at this point in all-wheel drive. So those of you who know Pajeros know that they have an all-wheel drive system where the center locker is not engaged. So the center locker wouldn't engage, and I certainly didn't have low range. The transfer case wouldn't do anything at all. It was nothing at all. But I could get drive to all four wheels, but it was an all-wheel drive without a center locker. And again, not that it's necessarily coming through on the videos, but there was a bit of a weird noise coming from the drivetrain. I suspect that's loose broken pieces rattling around inside the transfer case. So at this point, it was just a case of, let's get this thing as close to Dargo as we can, and we'll figure out from there. So the first goal was to get into Talbotville. So we kind of abandoned the whole blue rag idea. You can see Bruce up ahead of me there in his 200, because again, we figured if it jammed up completely and I wasn't going to be able to continue, it was going to be a lot easier to move the vehicle if we had someone in front of us who could tow from the front rather than everyone being behind me. So we're still climbing up the Spur track here towards that Brewery Creek Road. Again, this is a pretty steep, steady climb that fortunately I was able to complete in all-wheel drive. The traction control temperature sensor was going nuts. If you've got a Pajero, you know what I'm talking about. Without the centre lockers engaged, without low range being engaged, the traction control goes a bit nuts on these sort of climbs, and it does get hot, and then it starts beeping at you. It's a feature. But notwithstanding all of that, I was pretty amazed that we actually were able to drive out of there. So this is just pulling up here on the Brewery Creek Road, which we turned right onto. Obviously, we're going to originally go left and go north, and then we followed that down a good sort of 10 to 12 Ks. It's all two-wheel drive into Talbotville. So if you've been to Talbotville before, or you've seen my Crooked River video, this is the crossing at the bottom end of Talbotville. Again, not particularly deep. We went in here, tried to have a bit more of a closer look at the vehicle while we've got some level ground, and figure out a plan of attack. So again, I'll let Bruce get all the way through, because at this point I really had no idea how the vehicle was going to go driving through water. Was there a big hole in the transfer case? With all the bash plates and everything underneath, I had no idea. We're kind of just driving blind. So we drove over here to Talbotville, pulled up, and probably spent a good half an hour trying to figure out what our options were. Should we leave the vehicle here? Should I keep driving it? And in the end, I kind of decided, well, it was driving, and it was driving okay, so let's get it as far out as we can. But because I didn't have low range and I didn't have a centre locker, I wanted to stay off the steeper stuff. So I asked the guys if they were up to driving the Crooked River track, because I decided, I don't know whether I was right or wrong, but I decided that a flatter, wetter track with river crossings was going to be better than trying to drive McMillan's Road, which is reasonably steep, and out that way. That would have been more direct and shorter. Yeah. And Mark, of course, on his Colorado doesn't have a snorkel, and we really didn't know how deep the crossings were going to be. So, yeah, this was the first one. And look, every crossing I sort of drove successfully. I was encouraged to keep going. So yeah, crossing after crossing, and again, at this point we're just trying to get home, or at least get the vehicle as far as possible. So there's not heaps of footage. I grabbed a little bit on the GoPro, and I think you'll see we got some decent footage of the very last crossing, and that was about it. So yeah, just giving the guys some advice on where the line sits for some of these crossings, because they are fairly wide, and it does make a big difference where you actually drive on a lot of these Crooked River crossings in terms of just how deep they are or they aren't. Because obviously Mark in his Colorado doesn't want the front of his bonnet going under like the front of my bonnet just went under there, because he doesn't have a snorkel. And not that I've got footage of it, but he did get across just fine. Again, this is a crossing that always seems to have a lot of water dragged up out of it, and there were some guys with some vehicle trouble of their own on the other side here, so we just waited up for those to clear a space so we could get past. It seemed to be the day for people having vehicle challenges. So again, having gotten to Talbotville, our next milestone was to try and get to Dargo, and then from there figure out if and how we might get home. So yeah, this is the crossing that has the mud hole just through the gate. So many crossings on the Crooked River track. You can see there the water's moving pretty well, but certainly this initial section here, it's not that deep.
This one might be one where you go left against the line as well. Yep.
And at this point I really wasn't going to even turn the vehicle off, because I sort of thought, you know, once I stop that drivetrain turning, will it start up again? There's some tree fall there that somebody had kindly already cleared for us. Now I'm pretty sure this is finally the last river crossing on the Crooked River. This does have a little bit of an interesting exit, usually on that far side, and I think part of the banking is probably collapsed. Not sure how well you can see it there on the screen, but there's a pretty spiky looking stick that's fallen down in the track there. I had enough problems already with the transfer case, having failed. Mark kindly came down and fished that out for me. Didn't want to drive over that and do further damage to my already damaged vehicle.
That's the one. Yeah, just chuck it over there.
So we did get some external footage of this being the last crossing, which was good. Reasonably deep, but not hugely deep. And while the water's moving, it's not moving super fast. So here's the exit from that same crossing, just shot from the GoPro. See the rock there in the middle. It's got a few good scrape marks on it from diffs going over the top of it. It's one to keep an eye out on this particular exit. But then once you're up and out, it's a pretty easy roam. So I think this trip was Bruce's first time doing river crossings in his 200, so lucky he already had a snorkel. He's probably the highest vehicle anyway, so it probably didn't really matter in his case, but yeah, why stop at 1 for your first trip with a river crossing? Yeah, I think it was about 7 for the Crooked River. And he's driven that quite comfortably. And Mark in his Colorado. Now, as I said, keep in mind, Mark hasn't done a lot of river crossings previously either. He's done a couple of smaller ones. Doesn't have a snorkel. That's a pretty wide bloody river to drive across without a snorkel. So we had sort of well checked the depth for him before going across, and sort of, take it slow and steady. You don't want too big a bow wave coming up into your air intake or anything like that. And as you can see there, you probably don't really want this river crossing to be much deeper than what it is. And on the way out here, it doesn't quite have the clearance that either Bruce or I have got, but he gets the job done. Now from here it was about a 45-minute run or so into Dargo, where we stopped, got some dinner. It was like 5:30, 6 o'clock by the time we got to Dargo, and we decided to push on from there and try and get home. The car was still going, so while I could drive it, I figured I would. So we had to plot a route home with the top end of the Dargo High Plains Road being shut. So we headed along the Upper Dargo Road, and then from there on to Birragun Road, up past Mount Birragun and the Dog's Grave, and then from there we jumped onto the Dinner Plain track and took that all the way up to Dinner Plain, back on to the Great Alpine Road and home. And as I said, we got home like around almost midnight. So thanks for watching. Hope you've enjoyed this video, and see you in the next one.